I bound my chest until my ribs bruised and rubbed soot into my skin every single morning. In the Alpha's ruthless army, being discovered as a girl meant a fate far worse than death. I thought my disguise as a scrawny recruit named Leo was flawless, until the day Alpha King Kyle walked past my ranks. He froze. His massive chest heaved as he caught the scent he had been hunting for years, the sweet, undeniable scent of his fated mate. But when he looked down, he didn't see his queen. He saw a filthy, trembling boy reeking of her scent. His eyes turned a violent, glowing red. He didn't realize the truth. He thought I had touched her. He thought I had hurt her. Before I could even gasp, his massive hand was at my throat, lifting me off the dirt. He dragged me down to the royal dungeons, roaring at me to confess where I was hiding his mate. And as the torture began, I realized the cruelest joke of the moon goddess. My fated mate was going to destroy me, just to find me. If you want to find out how long she survives being tortured by the man fated to love her, hit that subscribe button. And let's get straight into it. Veldara did not look like a kingdom built on fear. That was the cruelest part. The capital rose from the valley floor in tiers of black granite and pale stone, its towers catching the morning light like drawn blades. Markets ran along the lower roads, merchants called out prices, children chased dogs between cartwheels, and if you didn't know what to look for, you might almost believe it was simply a city. Loud, alive, ordinary. But Lyra knew what to look for. She had learned within her first week. The labor columns moved before dawn. Women from conquered packs, heads down, feet bare on the cobblestones, escorted by vanguard soldiers who didn't bother with chains because they didn't need them. Everyone in Veldara understood the arithmetic. Run, and your pack paid for it. The ones who had no pack left didn't run either. They had already done that math and found nothing on the other side of the equation worth fleeing toward. Lyra watched them from the edge of the recruit yard each morning and pressed her bound chest against the cold fence post and breathed through it. That is not my life, she told herself. I chose differently. What she didn't say, even inside her own mind, was the rest of it. I chose this instead, and I am not certain it is better. She had been Leo for 4 months by then. Leo, who was scrawny and quiet and kept his eyes down during inspections. Leo, who volunteered for the worst latrine rotations because it kept him away from the bathhouse. Leo, who ate fast and slept with his back to the wall and had a talent, everyone agreed, for simply not being noticed. The 3 recruits who bunked nearest to her had stopped questioning Leo's strangeness within the first week. Bram was a broad, slow-spoken boy from the northern valleys who had enlisted to send coin home to a sick mother and asked very little of the world in return. Fen was wiry and loud, a natural comic who used humor the way other people used armor, and who had appointed himself Leo's protector after Leo had taken a shove from a senior recruit and not shoved back. Cass was the quietest of the 3, older than the others, with a veteran's economy of movement and a habit of watching exits. And he was the one Lyra trusted least, not from dislike but from the simple fact that observant people were dangerous when you were hiding something. None of them knew. She was certain of it. Bram, because he was kind and incurious. Fen, because he looked outward, not inward. Cass, because... She told herself this firmly, regularly, because even Cass's sharp eyes would not look for something that had never occurred to him to find. Her mornings ran like liturgy. She woke before the others, while the barrack was still black and thick with the sound of sleeping men, and she performed each step in order. The soot worked from the heel of her palm into her jaw and neck and the backs of her hands, dulling the relative softness of her skin into something rougher, dirtier, unremarkable. The bindings next, linen strips wound from just below her arms to her lower ribs, pulled tight enough to flatten, not tight enough to crack. She had cracked one rib in the second week, misjudged the tension, and had spent a fortnight breathing in millimeters and praying no one noticed her wince. Then the oversized undershirt, then the recruit blacks, then the belt buckled on its widest notch to suggest a waist with no curve to hide. By the time Bram rolled over and yawned and asked if there was any water left in the jug, Leo was already sitting on the edge of the bunk pulling on boots, completely unremarkable, just another boy starting another gray morning in the Vanguard's 4th Infantry rotation. It was during one of those gray mornings, Fen arguing with a cook's assistant over the consistency of the porridge, Bram eating his without complaint, Cass watching the yard over his bowl, that the rumors reached them. They always came through Fen. He had a gift for absorbing gossip from the air the way other people absorbed weather. "Third week running," Fen said, dropping onto the bench and jerking his chin toward the palace that loomed above the yard's northern wall. "That the king hasn't taken a meeting in full form." Bram looked up. "What does that mean?" "Means his eyes are doing the thing," Fen said, lowering his voice to something that wanted to be casual and wasn't quite. "The red. Even his generals are handling him through doors now, sending documents under the gap rather than walking in." Cass set his bowl down, said nothing. Lyra kept eating and looked at the palace and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had heard this before, in her own pack, before everything ended. The way people spoke about an unmated alpha approaching the edge. Careful, circling words. The way you'd describe a crumbling wall before you'd admit the building was coming down. Mate starvation, the elders called it. Not a metaphor. An actual unraveling. An alpha without a bond was a fire burning without a hearth. Contained, until it wasn't. She looked where Fen had gestured. There, on the high palace rampart, a figure stood motionless against the pale sky. Too far for features. Close enough for shape. The breadth of the shoulders, the absolute stillness, the way he stood like something that had forgotten it was allowed to move. Bet he was looking at the yard. Lyra dropped her gaze back to her bowl and took another mouthful, and did not look up again. She had not survived 4 months by looking at dangerous things too long. The thing about disappearing was that it got easier. That was what nobody told you. Not that survival was hard, but that it was disturbingly, guiltily simple once you learned its rhythms. Lyra had expected the disguise to feel like holding her breath indefinitely, a constant straining tension she would have to white-knuckle through every waking hour. Instead, it had settled into her body like a second skeleton. Leo moved differently than Lyra had. Broader steps, less apology in the shoulders, a particular way of dropping onto a bench that took up space without thinking about it, because boys did not think about the space they occupied. They simply occupied it. She had studied them carefully in those first weeks. The way Bram scratched the back of his neck when he was uncertain. The way Fen's hands were always moving, always illustrating, as though his words couldn't carry the full weight of his meaning alone. The way Cass ate with one elbow on the table and nobody told him not to. Small things. She had assembled Leo from those small things the way you'd build a shelter. Nothing grand, just enough to keep the weather out. And it worked. That was the part that sat strangely in her chest. It actually worked. Fen had started saving her a seat at meals 3 weeks in, the way you'd save a seat for someone without deciding to. It just became what he did, the same way the sun came up, unremarked upon. And Bram had lent her his spare bootlaces when hers snapped during a drill and hadn't asked for them back. Even Cass, who watched everything and volunteered nothing, had once stepped between Leo and a senior recruit who was working himself towards something ugly, and had done it with such quiet authority that the senior recruit had simply walked away, recalculating. Lyra had not had anyone step in front of her in a long time. She didn't let herself feel it too much. Feeling things too much was a luxury Leo couldn't afford, and she had grown so practiced at the suppression that she sometimes reached for an emotion in the evening and found only a smooth surface where it should have been, like pressing your tongue to a tooth that was no longer there. At night was different. And at night the barrack breathed and shifted around her, and she lay in the narrow dark with one hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling the bindings beneath her undershirt, and she allowed herself exactly as much truth as it took to fall asleep. She was erasing herself, not just the surface of herself, the hair, the shape, the voice, but something deeper and harder to name. There was a version of Lyra that had existed before her pack fell. A girl who had known her own face in still water without flinching, who had taken up a particular amount of space in a room and not apologized for it. That girl felt very distant now. Not dead, just buried under so many layers of soot and silence that Lyra could no longer find her quickly. She told herself it was worth it. It was. And she knew what the alternative looked like. She had watched it shuffle past in bare feet before dawn. But the other thing she could not explain was this. It had started perhaps 6 weeks in. A low sensation, formless and directionless, that lived just beneath her sternum in the hours before sleep. Not grief. She knew grief, had spent the first weeks swallowing it in mouthfuls. This was different. Less like loss, and more like anticipation stripped of its object. Like waiting for something that hadn't told her what it was, or when it was coming. She had no name for it. She had checked herself for fever twice in the early weeks, certain it was physical, but her temperature was fine, and the feeling remained. A quiet, persistent ache like a note held just below the threshold of hearing. She ignored it the way she ignored everything that didn't have a practical solution. She pressed her hand to her sternum in the dark, and breathed through it, and eventually sleep came and took it with her. She did not know it was the mate pull. She did not know that somewhere above her, in the palace that loomed over the yard's northern wall, something in an unmated alpha's blood was pulling in the same directionless way toward a point neither of them could locate. She did not know that the moon goddess had already decided everything and was simply waiting for the geometry of it to align. She only knew that some mornings she woke with the sensation already present, like it had been there all night, keeping watch. It was a Tuesday, gray and cold, the yard smelling of rain that hadn't fallen yet. When the announcement came, Draven heard it first, naturally. He arrived at the breakfast bench with the particular energy he got when information was hot, dropping down beside Lyra and leaning in before he'd even reached for his bowl. "Inspection," he said. "Real one. Dawn tomorrow." Bram frowned. "We had inspection last month." "Not like this." Fenn's voice had lost its usual performance of ease. Something underneath it was careful. "The king, personally. Full infantry review, all 4 rotation units, in the main yard." The table went quiet in the way that tables went quiet when something shifted from inconvenient to significant. Lyra did not move. She kept her eyes on her food and her hands still on the table, and her breathing measured and even. She was very good at this, at keeping the surface of herself completely undisturbed while everything beneath it rearranged in cold silence. Tomorrow. The king. The open yard with nowhere to hide, and 100 bodies pressed into formation, and whatever was happening behind those red eyes, making its way down from the ramparts and into the space she occupied. She pressed her boot flat against the floor and held it there. She had survived worse. She had survived the night her pack burned, survived the columns on the road, survived 4 months of this. She would survive an inspection. She told herself that with great conviction and went back to eating, and did not sleep at all that night. They were told to stand straight and say nothing. But Lyra stood straight and said nothing, and concentrated on a fixed point at the middle distance, a crack in the far wall of the yard, thin as a hair, running from the second stone to the third, and she breathed, in through the nose, slow, out through the mouth, slower. Leo's breathing. Leo's posture. Shoulders squared, chin level, weight distributed evenly between both feet the way the drill master had spent 3 weeks correcting into them. Around her, 400 recruits stood in 8 columns of 50, arranged by rotation unit across the main yard's gray expanse. The sky was the color of old pewter. The rain that had threatened all week had not come, which meant the air was dense and still, pressure-heavy, the kind of morning that made sound travel further than it should. Yet she could hear the boots of the palace guard on the rampart above. She could hear Fenn, 3 bodies to her left, breathing through his mouth the way he did when he was nervous and trying not to show it. She did not look at the palace gates. She heard them open. The sound moved through the yard before the man did. A shift in the quality of the silence. 400 bodies pulling fractionally straighter, the instinctive animal response to the presence of an apex. Lyra kept her eyes on the crack in the far wall and felt it anyway. The particular weight of him crossing the yard, the way the open space seemed to contract around his movement. She had seen him once, at distance, a silhouette against the pale sky. That had been enough to file him under dangerous and look away. She could not look away now. Yet her peripheral vision filled in what her turned head refused to confirm. A figure moving along the first column with the slow mechanical pace of a man completing a function. Broad, armored in black that caught no light. He walked with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes fixed somewhere past the recruits' faces, not seeing them so much as passing through them, and she understood immediately what Fenn's rumors had been reaching for. This was not a king conducting an inspection. This was an organism performing the memory of one. The generals flanked him at a careful distance. She noticed that too. He moved along the first column, then the second. She tracked his progress the way you tracked a storm, not looking directly, but always knowing exactly where it was. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, the bindings tight across her ribs, at the soot itching faintly along her jaw in the cold. She catalogued each sensation deliberately, pinning her attention to the physical, keeping Leo's face arranged in neutral boredom. Third column. He was on the third column now. The wind shifted. It was such a small thing. A turn in the air, barely enough to lift the short hairs at the back of her neck, carrying the cold from the northern end of the yard down across the columns in a single slow exhale. She felt it pass over her. She registered it as weather and nothing more, and that was the last moment she had before everything changed. He stopped. Not the gradual deceleration of a man who had seen something. A full, absolute stop, like a door slamming shut in a silent house. She felt the stillness before she saw it, the cessation of his footfall. The quality of the air in the yard suddenly altered. The generals behind him pulling up short with the careful wariness of men who had learned not to crowd him. She watched from the corner of her eye as his chest expanded. Once, slowly. His head turned a fraction, not toward any face in the column, but upward, slightly, the way an animal orients toward a scent rather than a sight. Then it happened. The thing she had told herself wouldn't. He turned toward her column. His pace was different now. Not the mechanical procession of before. This was something focused, something narrowing, each step deliberate in the way that predatory things were deliberate when the distance between them and their quarry was closing. She heard the generals exchange a word behind him, low and urgent. She heard one of them increase his pace to match. Yet she stared at the crack in the far wall and did not move and did not breathe, and became as much of nothing as she had ever managed in her life. He stopped in front of her. Lyra looked at him because there was nothing else left to do. Up close, he was worse than the silhouette. The black armor was edged in dark gold and fitted to a frame that made the recruit standing beside her look like a child's drawing of a person. His face was angular, hard-cut, bearing the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept without violence in a long time, and his eyes, which she had heard described and had not fully believed until now, were not quite red. They were amber fighting red, amber losing. They moved over Leo's face with an expression she could not parse. Something cracked open behind them. Confusion first, raw and unguarded. The expression of a man whose certainty had just met something that didn't fit inside it. He looked at her the way you looked at a sentence that didn't end where it was supposed to. Then the confusion curdled. She watched it happen, watched the amber lose its last ground to the red, watched the confusion become something else entirely, something vast and volcanic and entirely beyond reason, and she understood with perfect clarity and zero ability to act on it that he had drawn the wrong conclusion and was already certain of it. His roar came from somewhere below language. It hit the yard like a physical thing. Recruits flinching back, A general shouting, birds erupting from the ramparts above. Lyra had 1/2 second in which her body decided to run and discovered it had nowhere to go before his hand closed around her throat. The ground left her feet. She did not scream. She had no air to scream with. She looked down at him from 3 inches above the dirt, her hands finding his gauntlet by instinct and finding no give in it whatsoever, and she thought with extraordinary calm, "This is how 4 months ends." His eyes were fully red now, and they were looking at her like she had taken something that belonged to him. The dungeon smelled like iron and extinguished things. They had not been gentle on the way down. 2 soldiers, neither of whom looked at her face, had carried her more than walked her through the palace's lower passages, a descent of 3 staircases, each colder than the last, the torchlight thinning as the stone closed in. Yet they had put her in a room with a single chain fixed to the far wall and a drain in the center of the floor that she did not look at for long. Then they had left, and the door had closed, and she had sat with her back against the wall and taken the most careful inventory of her body she had ever conducted. Throat bruised, but not crushed. Left shoulder wrenched from the handling on the stairs. 3 fingers on her right hand swelling at the knuckle where she had gripped his gauntlet. Nothing broken that she could find, which told her the hand at her throat had been controlled even in its fury. That somewhere beneath the frenzy, something had held a precise and terrible line. She had filed that detail away before she'd even finished finding it. She did not know how long she waited. Long enough for the cold to move from the floor through her recruit blacks and into her bones. Long enough for the torch in the wall bracket to burn a quarter of the way down. She used the time the way she used most things, practically. She tested the chain's anchor point, solid, not going anywhere. She noted the door's hinge placement. It opened inward, which meant she couldn't use it as a weapon even if she were free. She memorized the distances between fixed points in the room, and then she sat back down and pressed her hand to her sternum and breathed and waited. The door opened like a controlled demolition. He filled the frame in a way that was not metaphorical. He had removed the outer armor, the black plate, met the gold-edged pauldrons, and stood in a dark undershirt and trousers with the bearing of a man who was expending significant effort on the simple act of remaining upright and not destroying the room. His eyes were moving. That was the first thing she clocked. Not fixed red, but cycling, amber bleeding to red, and back again in slow, irregular pulses, like an ember that couldn't decide whether to catch. He didn't speak immediately. He paced. 4 steps to the left, 4 steps back. The movement of something that needed to burn through its own energy before it could direct itself. His hands opened and closed at his sides. She tracked him without moving her head and kept her expression at the careful neutral she'd had 4 months to perfect. When he stopped, it was directly in front of her. "What did you do to her?" Not a question, but the syntax of absolute conviction. Lyra said nothing. Leo would say nothing. Leo was terrified. Leo had no idea what this enormous, unraveling man was talking about. Leo's silence was the silence of incomprehension rather than concealment. She held that distinction in her mind like a compass bearing and let it organize her face. "I can still smell her on you." His voice dropped to something that was almost worse than the roar. Low and frayed at the edges, the voice of a man translating something from a language that didn't have words for what he was feeling. "Her scent is on your skin, on your clothes. So you are going to tell me where she is, and what you did, and whether she is still—" He stopped. Something moved through his expression too quickly to name. "Whether she is alive." "I don't know what you're talking about," Lyra said. Leo's voice, register low, delivery flat with the blankness of genuine confusion. He grabbed her collar. The movement was fast enough that she had no time to brace. She was up off the floor again, not by the throat this time, but by the front of her recruit blacks. His fist twisted in the fabric, her face 6 inches from his. The red surged in his eyes. She could feel the heat coming off him, an almost feverish warmth, and she could feel his breath against her face, and she could see, this close, the precise degree of deterioration in his expression. Not just anger, she understood now, but something that had been eating him from the inside long before she arrived in his dungeon. And then she noticed it. It was subtle enough that she almost catalogued it as imagination. His grip on her collar did not loosen, but his breathing, which had been audible and ragged since he entered the room, slowed. Not much, enough to measure. The red in his eyes dimmed a fraction, the amber underneath reasserting itself with the tentative quality of something that hadn't been seen in a while. He didn't notice. He was still talking, demanding, accusing, his voice cycling between cold fury and something rawer. But his body had made a separate decision entirely. The closer he was to her, the quieter something underneath all that rage became. She filed it, said nothing about it, let him exhaust the first wave of questions against Leo's baffled silence, and watched his eyes and breathed and thought. He dropped her eventually, stepped back as though the proximity had cost him something he hadn't planned to spend. But he stood in the center of the room with his back half turned, and one hand pressed against his jaw, and he was quiet for long enough that the torch crackle filled the space between them. "I'm not finished with you," he said finally. The words were directed at the floor. Then he walked out. The door closed. The torch guttered in the displaced air. Lyra lowered herself back to the ground, pressed her spine against the cold wall, and stared at the space where he'd been standing. Her pulse was still too fast. Her collar was stretched where his fist had twisted it, 3 fingers still throbbing on her right hand. She turned the detail over carefully in the dark, examining it from every angle. His breathing had slowed, his eyes had dimmed. He doesn't know, she thought. But his wolf does. Kale didn't sleep. This was not new. The sleep had become a negotiation somewhere in the past year, something he could achieve in fragments if he was exhausted enough and the wolf was quiet enough, 2 conditions that aligned less and less frequently as the months accumulated. But the night after the dungeon was different. He lay on his back in the dark of his chambers and stared at the ceiling and felt something he had no framework for, a stillness in his chest that had not been there before, occupying the space where the constant low-grade frenzy usually lived. It infuriated him. He turned it over for hours, prodding at it the way you'd probe a wound to assess its depth. He had gone down to the dungeon in a state of barely managed fury, had spent an hour in that room getting nothing from a boy who claimed to know nothing, and had come back up feeling, he hated the word even forming in his mind, settled, not satisfied, not closer to answers, simply quieter, in the way he had not been quiet in months, and the quietness had no rational source, and that made it worse. His wolf offered nothing useful. It never did these days. Just that endless low pull toward something absent, occasionally spiking into a frenzy that took hours to walk back from the edge of. Except last night it had not spiked. Last night it had pressed close to the surface, and then, in the dungeon, had gone still with the sudden completeness of an animal that had found a warm place to lie down. The boy knows something, Kale told himself. The wolf senses it. That is all this is. He was still telling himself that when dawn came. He was in the strategy room by early morning. At reviewing patrol reports he retained nothing from when Draven entered. His second moved with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was a form of weakness. Every action calibrated, nothing wasted. He set a cup of something hot beside Kyle's elbow and stood at a position that was technically at ease and practically anything but. "You look better," Draven said. "Don't." "I'm noting an observation. You were at approximately 30% functionality yesterday morning. Today you're closer to 60. A pause, brief and deliberate. "The interrogation was productive." "It will be." "The boy gave you something." "The boy gave me nothing." Kyle set the patrol report down. "He's hiding it. He'll break." Draven was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding which door to open. "And in the interim, you intend to keep him in the lower dungeon, personally conducting the sessions." Yes. Rather than delegating to. Yes. Another pause. Kale could feel Draven arranging something behind his expression with the careful architecture of a man who knew exactly how much to push and had made a precise calculation about the current limit. Of course, Draven said, and moved on to the patrol reports. But Kyle saw him pause at the door on the way out. Saw the slight adjustment in his posture, the fractional stilling of a man whose mind had just caught on something and was choosing not to show it. Draven would ask no more questions directly. He never did. When direct questions stopped working, he simply went and found the answers by other means, quietly, without announcing his route. That Kale let him go and returned to the reports and felt the unfamiliar stillness in his chest and hated it thoroughly. In the dungeon, Lyra was conducting her own assessment. 2 days since the first session. The swelling in her fingers had reduced to a dull ache she could work around. Her shoulder had loosened. The throat bruising had deepened to purple-green before it began to fade, which she tracked not from vanity, but because visible injury drew questions, and questions drew the kind of attention Leo could not afford. She had also been thinking, carefully, methodically, about the things she had noticed. She turned it over the way she turned over every resource she'd ever had to work with, practically, without sentiment, looking for its edges and its limits and what it might build into. His wolf quieted near her. His breathing slowed when he was close. The red in his eyes retreated toward Amber. He hadn't noticed any of it. He was too deep in the frenzy, too focused on the conclusion he'd already drawn to feel the thing happening underneath it. But she had noticed. And noticing meant she had something. When he came back on the third day, without the armor again, the same frayed edge energy radiating off him, the same cycling eyes, she made a small adjustment. She had been answering his questions in as few words as possible, Leo's strategy of bare minimum response. This time, she let him speak for longer before she answered, and when she answered, she let her voice stay low and even, rather than clipping it short. "You're not listening to me," he said, crouching to her eye level in a movement that brought him close enough that she could see the specific texture of the exhaustion on his face. "I'm listening," she said, quietly, no inflection of fear in it, just steadiness, a low, even note held without effort. He stopped. It was barely perceptible. A fraction of a second where the restless energy in him hit something and slowed. His eyes shifted, red to amber, amber holding slightly longer than before. She watched it happen and kept her face neutral and her voice level and felt the shape of what she was working with come into focus. She was not just surviving the sessions. She understood that now with a clarity that was equal parts useful and devastating. Every time she spoke in that register, every time she held the steadiness rather than flinching, she was doing something to the wolf that the wolf's own king could not do for himself. She was the only thing in Veldara that could quiet him. And he was going to keep coming back to the thing that gave him relief, without ever understanding that he was the one causing the wound. He came earlier than usual. Lyra had developed a rough sense of his schedule from the pattern of torch replacements and meal deliveries. The dungeon had its own clock, dim and unreliable, but she had always been good at reading the time from indirect things. He typically came in the evening, when the palace above had exhausted its formal demands on him, and whatever remained of his composure had thinned to its most dangerous point. This time the torch was still bright when the door opened, which meant afternoon. Which meant something had changed in the rhythm of things up above. She straightened from where she'd been sitting against the wall, Leo's posture, automatic. But he didn't cross the room. He came in, and he closed the door behind him, and he sat down on the low stone shelf along the opposite wall, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone whose body had simply decided it was finished standing. He set his forearms on his knees, and he looked at her, and he said nothing. Lyra said nothing either. She had learned that silence, in this room, belonged to whoever could hold it longest without needing to fill it, and she had 4 months of practiced disappearance behind her. She waited. He looked terrible. That was the plain fact of it, stripped of everything else. The angular face had hollowed further since the first session, cheekbones sharpened, the skin beneath his eyes darkened to bruise purple. His eyes tonight were more amber than red, which should have made him less frightening and somehow didn't, because the amber held something the red didn't, an exhaustion so complete it had passed through desperation and come out the other side into something quieter and worse. He was just a man sitting in a dungeon. That was what kept catching her off guard. Beneath all of it, beneath the armor and the frenzy and the hand at her throat, there were moments where the scale of him reduced to something simply and terribly human. She found those moments more dangerous than the rage. The silence stretched long enough that the torch crackled into it twice. Then he said, not as an interrogation opener, and not as a demand, just as a question asked toward the floor between them. "Are you afraid of me?" Lyra's breath held for one careful second. It was not his voice. That was the thing. It was his voice. The same register, the same low frequency, but emptied of the particular quality that had driven every previous session. No accusation in it. No architecture of fury underneath. Just the question, bare and undefended, and she understood with a clarity that moved through her like cold water that it was not the king asking. The king had spent 5 sessions demanding and threatening and building cases from wrong conclusions. This was the wolf, surfacing through the exhaustion, asking something it actually wanted to know. She could have deflected. Leo would have deflected, gone wide-eyed and stammering. Thub played the confusion card that had served her across 5 sessions of impossible questions. It was the correct strategic move, and she knew it, and she was so tired. Not physically, though that was present too, a bone-deep weariness from nights on stone and days inside her own head. But tired in the way that came from performing a version of yourself so consistently that you could no longer find where the performance ended without searching for it. She said, "Yes, but not for the reason you think." The room changed. It was not dramatic. No sharp movement, no shift in the torchlight, nothing that could be pointed to as the moment. He simply went still, in a way that was different from his previous stillnesses, not the coiling stillness of something about to strike, but the absolute arrested quiet of a person who had heard something land in an unexpected place inside them and needed a moment to understand the impact. His eyes came up from the floor, found her face. Lyra did not look away, and immediately understood that was a mistake, because looking at him directly in the amber, not the red, the amber, the part of him that was simply a person, was an entirely different problem than anything she had navigated in this room before. The bond ache, which she had grown accustomed to managing as background noise, sharpened into something with edges. She held his gaze anyway. It was the only honest thing she had given him, and she found she could not take it back. He didn't ask what she meant. She thought perhaps he was afraid of what she'd say. She thought perhaps she was afraid of what she'd say too. And the shared nature of that fear sat between them like something neither of them was willing to name. He did not ask another question, did not return to the script of prior sessions. The mate, the location, what the boy had done. He simply stayed. On the opposite wall, forearms on his knees, eyes moving over her face with an expression she had no word for, and suspected she should not try to find one. His wolf was the quietest she had ever felt it. Not just dimmed, genuinely quiet, the way a room went quiet when something that had been making noise for so long you'd stopped hearing, it finally stopped. She thought, this is the cruelest thing the moon goddess has done yet. Not the dungeon, not the sessions. This, sitting 3 feet from the person fated to be hers, watching him find the first peace he'd had in years, and knowing she was the source of it, and being unable to say a single true word about any of it. A guard knocked twice, his summons back to the palace. Kael stood slowly, looked at her for one more moment with that unreadable expression. Then he left. Lyra pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her face against them, and did not make a sound, and shook for a long time in the dark. Not from pain. She almost wished it were pain. Pain had a location and a cause and eventually an end. This had none of those things. The morning after Kyle's wordless visit, a different soldier came to her door. She knew immediately it was not a routine check. Routine checks involved a slot in the door and a food tray and approximately 4 seconds of human contact. This was a full entry, 2 guards, the door held open, and a calm instruction to stand and follow that carried the specific quality of a request that was not a request. They walked her up. Not to the interrogation room she had come to map precisely in her mind, but further, along a different corridor she hadn't seen, narrower, lit by sconces rather than brackets, ending in a door that was unremarkable in every way except that unremarkable doors in palaces were never unremarkable. One of the guards knocked twice. A voice from inside said, "Enter," without any variation in tone, the way people spoke when they had no interest in performing authority because they had never needed to. Commander Draven stood at a table covered in documents. He did not look up immediately when she was brought in, which she recognized as a technique rather than distraction, the deliberate withholding of attention as its own form of pressure. She had seen Kyle use fury. Draven, she understood in the first 10 seconds, used precision. He would be significantly harder to manage. When he did look up, his eyes moved over her face and then, unhurriedly, over the rest of her, and she had the unsettling sensation of being read rather than seen. "Sit," he said, and indicated the chair across the table. She sat. Leo's posture, spine straight, hands loose on her knees, the mild, attentive expression of someone who had nothing to hide and was slightly confused about why they'd been brought here. She assembled it in the half-second she had and held it and waited. "You're not in any additional trouble," Draven said, settling into the chair opposite with the unhurried ease of a man conducting a conversation he had already concluded. "I have some routine questions about your enlistment records. Straightforward. Answer them honestly, and you'll be back in your cell within the hour." "Routine," she noted. "He wants me relaxed." "Your pack," he said, opening a document she could not read from her angle. "You registered as coming from the Ashvin territory, northern border." "Yes." "Ashvin was absorbed 14 months ago. We have comprehensive records of the population census conducted in the aftermath." He looked up. "Your name doesn't appear in them." "I left before the absorption," she said. The answer was prepared. She had built Leo's history with the same attention she had given Leo's posture, accounting for exactly this kind of gap. "Months before. But I was already on this road. To enlist. To survive. Enlisting came after." Draven made a small note. She could not tell if it was a real note or a prop. "You were how old when you left Ashvin?" 16. "And you'd been on the road alone for, by my calculation, roughly 8 months before you registered with the 4th rotation intake?" "Approximately." "You don't look like someone who spent 8 months on the road." There it was. She kept her expression at the same mild attentiveness and said, "I found work where I could. It wasn't always rough country." His eyes dropped to her hands. She had known this was coming, had known it was a vulnerability since the 2nd week, and she had done what she could. The soot helped. She'd started pressing her knuckles into the stone floor of the dungeon each night, and not enough to break skin, but enough to roughen the surface incrementally. It wasn't sufficient, and she had always known it wasn't sufficient, and here was the proof. "Laboring work," he said. "Mainly." "Your hands are quite smooth for mainly laboring work." She said nothing. Leo would not have a good answer for that. Leo would get slightly uncomfortable and shift his weight, and that would look like the ordinary discomfort of a young man caught in a small exaggeration rather than the thing it actually was. She shifted her weight, let the silence sit. Draven watched her do it, and she had the particular cold sensation of a person who had just made a move and was not certain whether the opponent had accounted for it or was simply waiting for her to finish. "Your voice," he said, changing direction with no announcement. It pitches occasionally, when you're caught off guard. Have you been told that? I was sick for a long stretch on the road. My voice never fully settled after. Another note. Real or prop, she still couldn't tell. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a hypothesis and was now deciding how much longer to test it before he committed to it. One more question. During the Alpha King sessions, has he indicated to you why specifically he believes you have information about his mate? The pivot was deliberate. She was supposed to be off balance from the previous questions, more likely to give something real in the lurch between subjects. He smelled something on me, she said carefully. I don't know what. I've told him I don't know what. Yet he doesn't believe me. Draven held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, made a final notation, and closed the document. Thank you, he said pleasantly. That's all for now. The guards walked her back. She descended the stairs with her face composed and her mind running fast and cold through everything that had just happened. For now. Those two words were the whole problem, small and precise as a blade between the ribs. He had not concluded, but he was close. She could feel the shape of his thinking the way you felt weather coming, and when Draven reached his conclusion, he would not roar and grab her by the throat. He would simply file the paperwork. She had days, perhaps fewer. She pressed her back against the dungeon wall in the silence and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time since the inspection yard, Bess let herself feel the full dimensions of the trap she was in. Kale would destroy her by accident, Draven would destroy her on purpose, and the only door between her and both of those outcomes was the truth, the one thing that opened onto its own kind of destruction. She closed her eyes. She had to move first. She just didn't know yet what moving looked like. 3 days. She counted them by torch replacements and the narrow thread of cold air that moved through the dungeon's upper vent at what she had calculated was dawn. 3 days since Draven's questioning. 3 days since Kyle had last come down the stairs. In that absence, she had done 2 things. She had thought, continuously and without resolution, about the shrinking window between her and Draven's conclusion. And she had noticed, with a quieter and more unsettling awareness, that the bond ache had changed quality. It had sharpened from its usual low, directionless pull into something with a specific orientation, like a compass needle that had finally found its north and was now straining toward it with an urgency that had nothing to do with her own wishes. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum each night and breathed through it and told herself it was manageable. On the 3rd night, she woke from shallow sleep to the sound of the door. She knew before she saw him that something was wrong. The sound of his entry was different, not the controlled force of his usual arrivals, that compressed energy held on a short lead. This was effortful. The door opened slowly, the footstep across the threshold carrying the particular weight of a body working against itself. When the torchlight found him, she went very still. He looked like something that had been taken apart and not fully reassembled. The hollowness she had tracked progressing across his face over the past weeks had reached a new depth. Cheeks sunken, the tendons in his neck visible from across the room, hands trembling with the fine continuous vibration of extreme exertion or extreme cold. He was not wearing the undershirt from previous sessions, just the dark trousers, his feet bare on the stone, as though dressing had been a negotiation he had only partially won. And his eyes, fixed, flat, the cycling between red and amber entirely absent. Just red. A steady, lightless red, like coals at the bottom of a fire that had been burning too long on too little. He did not speak. He crossed the room and stood in the center of it, and his chest moved in the shallow, rapid pattern of an animal in distress, and he looked at her with those flat red eyes, and she understood with absolute clarity that there was no king present in this room tonight, only the wolf, and the wolf was at the edge. Kyle. She said his name without planning to. Not Leo's voice, Not quite her full voice either, but the register beneath both of them, the one that lived in her chest rather than her throat, low and even and direct. He flinched. The trembling in his hands intensified briefly and then, fractionally, slowed. She filed that and kept going, because stopping was not an option. It rained this morning, she said, quietly, steadily, as though continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. I could hear it through the vent. That particular sound it makes on stone, heavier than it sounds like it should be. My pack's territory had a stretch of pine forest along the eastern border, and when rain came in from the valley, it would hit the canopy first before it reached the ground. You could hear it moving toward you, like something breathing. He had not moved. His eyes were still red, but she watched them. She watched them the way she watched everything in this room, precisely and continuously. And there was a quality of attention in them now that had not been there when he entered. The frantic edge was still present, but it had found a surface to press against. The sound of her voice. She could feel it working the way you felt a current change underwater, a shift in pressure rather than a visible thing. She kept talking. As she talked about the pine forest in detail she had not thought she still possessed. The specific color the light went in late afternoon, when it came through the canopy at a low angle, the way the ground felt underfoot in early spring, when the frost had just released it, the smell of it after rain, that particular green-dark smell that had no name, but that she had known her entire childhood, and had not thought about once in 4 months of soot and stone. She talked about it because it was soft and it was steady, and those were the two things she had. No weapons, no freedom, no options that didn't detonate in her hands. Just a voice and the knowledge, hard-won and terrible, that this wolf responded to it. He went to the wall, not aggressively. It was almost the opposite of aggression. So he simply ran out of standing, and the wall caught him, and he slid down it to the floor with the slow gracelessness of extreme exhaustion, and sat with his back against the stone, and his knees up and his head tipped back, eyes closed, the red still present behind his lids in the way she could see it suffusing the skin. She did not stop talking. She moved from the pine forest to rain on a river she had crossed twice as a child, to the sound of fire made in a stone hearth in deep winter, to the weight of the first snowfall of the year on a roof. Nothing consequential, nothing that required a response. A long, low, unbroken thread of the softest things she could find in the inventory of herself, laid down steadily in the dark. The red behind his eyelids dimmed. Not gone. She did not deceive herself that it was gone. But dimmed. From that flat coal light to something that cycled again, amber reasserting itself in pulses that lengthened gradually, the wolf finding the edge, and then, incrementally, backing away from it. She watched him breathe, watched the trembling in his hands reduce from a continuous vibration to an occasional shudder to something approaching stillness. At some point, she could not have said when, his breathing deepened into sleep. She stopped talking then, sat in the quiet and looked at him, the Alpha King of Veldara, asleep on her dungeon floor, the feral break narrowly averted by the voice of the person he had been systematically tearing apart for weeks, and felt something move through her that was far too complicated to examine directly. She did not know if she had saved him tonight or simply delayed the inevitable. She suspected, with the cold clarity that had kept her alive this long, that the answer depended entirely on what she decided to do before Draven filed his report. She pressed her back against the wall and kept watch and did not sleep at all. And outside the vent, the rain continued its steady work against the stone. The notice came with the morning meal, not delivered to her directly. She heard it through the vent, the way she had learned to hear everything in this dungeon, by its effect on the people above rather than the thing itself. 2 guards in the corridor outside, voices low. One of them saying Draven's name and the word examination, and then dawn, and then military fraud tribunal, with the flat affect of men discussing paperwork rather than a person's life. She sat with the food tray untouched in front of her and let it settle. And so he had moved. She had calculated days, and he had given her less than one. The examination would be thorough, clinical, and conducted by people with neither Kael's frenzy nor his wolf's interference to work against. It would take approximately 4 minutes. Then the tribunal. Then the sentence, which was not a variable. The law was explicit, and Draven knew the law the way architects knew load-bearing walls. She had one night. She spent the daylight hours in a stillness that was different from her usual managed quiet. This was the stillness of someone who had finished calculating and arrived at the only remaining number. She had turned the problem over for weeks looking for a version of it that resolved without detonating, and there was no such version. There had never been a such version. The moon goddess had built this trap without an exit that didn't require destroying something, and the only question that remained was, who did the destroying and what was left after? She unwound the bindings early. Alone, in the dim afternoon light, she stood in the center of the cell and unpeeled the layers of Leo she had built so carefully over 4 months. Not dramatically, just practically, the way you'd dismantle a shelter you'd outgrown. The bindings first, unwound slowly from her ribs, and she breathed. A full breath, the first unrestricted breath she'd drawn in so long that the expansion of her lungs felt almost painful. Then the undershirt. She used the water from the meal tray to work the soot from her jaw and neck and the backs of her hands methodically until the skin beneath emerged pale and unmarked and entirely her own. She put the recruit's blacks back on. She needed to be dressed, but she left the bindings off, folded them, and set them by the wall. Then she sat down and waited for him. He came late, later than any previous session, deep enough into the night that the torch had burned low and the dungeon had reached its coldest point. She heard his step on the stair and knew immediately it was bad. The weight of it, the pace, the sound of a man who had made a decision and was moving inside its gravity. When he entered, his eyes were red and resolute, and he did not sit down. "I'm done waiting," he said. His voice had none of the frayed edges of the feral night. It was flat and final, which was worse. "You tell me where she is tonight, or I end this." Lyra stood up. He took it as defiance. She saw it register across his expression, and the red deepening. And he moved toward her with the contained deliberateness of someone who had already decided how this ended. She had perhaps 4 seconds before the decision became physical and irreversible. She reached under her shirt and pulled the linen free. It fell. White cloth on dark stone, and the sound it made was nothing. No sound at all. But what followed it was everything. Her true scent, unbound and unmuffled for the first time in 4 months, released into the enclosed air of the dungeon like something that had been held underwater finally breaking the surface. Not the faint, soot-dampened thread that had confused him in the inspection yard. The full thing, clean and undeniable and entirely catastrophically hers. He stopped mid-step. The shift that had been moving through him, the dark fur rising at his jaw, at the change in his hands, arrested completely, stopped mid-form as though the signal had simply ceased. The red in his eyes did not dim. It did something she had no word for. It broke open, the flatness shattering into something vast and raw that was beyond fury and beyond grief and beyond any of the things she had watched move through him across 8 sessions in this room. The silence was absolute. She looked at him. He looked at her. The air between them was dense with the scent the moon goddess had apparently decided was the instrument of this entire catastrophe. And she was so tired. Tired in a way that went all the way down. And she was done performing, and done waiting, and done surviving, in the particular way that required her to be nothing. "My name is Lyra," she said, her own voice. Her real register, unhidden, the one she had not used in front of another person since the night her pack burned. "I am from the Ashvin territory. I bound my chest and cut my hair and covered my skin because your law gave me no other way to live." She paused. Let one breath pass. I am your fated mate. I have known since the inspection yard. You smelled me before I could tell you, and you drew the wrong conclusion, and I could not correct it without dying for it. Another breath. I am correcting it now. Kyle's legs went out from under him. Not a collapse. Not quite. More like a controlled surrender. The way a structure came down when the last load-bearing thing finally released. He went to his knees on the dungeon floor, and the sound of it, armor on stone, rang through the cell, and then there was silence again, and in the silence the bond hit them both. She felt it as impact, a wave that started in her sternum and moved outward through her entire body, rewriting every frequency she operated on simultaneously. The bond ache, that months-long directionless longing she had managed and suppressed and breathed through in the dark, resolved in a single devastating instant into something with a name and a face and a presence kneeling 3 feet away from her on cold stone. She heard him make a sound she had not heard from him before, low and broken and completely unguarded. The wolf, finally bonded. Finally, after years of feral starvation, given the thing it had been pulling toward. She stood and looked at him, the Alpha King of Veldara, undone on the floor of his own dungeon, and felt the full cruel geometry of it. He was hers, and she was his, and he had spent weeks tearing her apart looking for her, and he now understood, with the totality that the bond allowed no escape from, exactly what he had done. The horror on his face was the real climax, not the revelation, the reckoning. He did not leave the dungeon that night. He stayed on the floor where his knees had found the stone, and she stayed where she was standing, and the bond hummed between them like a live wire neither of them touched. There was nothing easy in the room, no softening of the air, no warmth rushing in to fill the space that the revelation had cleared. Just two people sitting inside the full weight of what had happened, and the torch burning lower and the cold. He asked her eventually to tell him. And not about the mate bond. He knew that now, with the totality of something written into his blood. He asked her to tell him what she had come from. The night her pack fell. The road. The decision to bind herself into nothing and walk into the mouth of the thing that had destroyed her home and call it survival. She told him. Plainly, without performance, the way you recounted facts to someone who needed them rather than a story to someone who wanted it. She watched his face while she spoke, and watched him receive each piece of it with the expression of a man being handed evidence against himself, item by item, unable to object to any of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My law," he said finally. Not a question, just the words placed in the air between them. "Your law," she agreed. He closed his eyes. She watched something move through him that was not the wolf and not the king, something underneath both, older, the part of him that had built the law from grief and believed, with the total conviction of a person who had never been on the receiving end of their own legislation, that it was protection rather than destruction. He left before dawn. He did not explain where he was going. He looked at her once from the doorway, a long, unreadable look that had the quality of a man memorizing something he was afraid of losing. And then he was gone, and she heard his footstep on the stair, and then silence. 2 guards came an hour later and walked her up, not to Draven's corridor, not to the interrogation room, up through the full height of the palace and into a wing she had never seen, where the stone gave way to plastered walls and the torches to proper sconces, and they put her in a room with a window and a wash basin and a bolt on the inside of the door, and left without explanation. She stood in the middle of it for a long moment, then she used the wash basin. The court convened at midday. She knew it was happening before anyone came to collect her. She could hear the palace's rhythm change above her, the particular density of movement that came with formal assembly, the muted percussion of a full council in session. When the guard came, she was already standing. The great hall was the architecture of authority made literal, high vaulted ceilings, columns of black stone, As the council arranged in tiered seating along both sides, and the generals at the floor level and Draven at the front, with the expression of a man who had filed the correct paperwork and was waiting for the correct outcome. She was brought to stand in the center of it. She did not look at Draven. She did not perform contrition or fear, or any of the things the room might have expected from someone in her position. She stood the way she had learned to stand in 4 months of being Leo, weight even, chin level, except that this time there was no soot on her face, and no binding beneath her shirt, and no false name sitting in her mouth like a stone. The marks from the dungeon were visible. She had not covered them. She had decided in the hours she'd spent in the room with the window that covering them would be its own kind of dishonesty. And she was done with those. Kale entered from the side door. He was in full formal armor, the black plate and dark gold, the iron crown seated properly, everything that signaled the king rather than the man. He moved to the front of the hall and turned to face the assembly with an expression that was composed and entirely unreadable. And she understood that whatever he had spent the hours since the dungeon doing, he had arrived at something. One of the generals spoke first, cited the law, its provisions, its penalties. His voice had the flat certainty of someone who considered the outcome predetermined and was simply completing the required procedural steps. When he finished, Kale was quiet for a moment. "My mother was a warrior," he said. The hall stilled. She watched the generals exchange glances and watched Draven's careful expression shift into something more alert. She was killed in the field because her commander considered women a liability and refused her proper armor. I built the law that bears my seal because I believed removing women from combat removed them from that particular death. He paused. I was wrong. I did not remove them from danger. I simply changed its shape and called it protection, and never stood inside it to see what it actually was. He looked at Lyra then, directly, the amber in his eyes steady and clear in the formal light of the hall. This woman survived the fall of her pack, 8 months on the road, and 4 months inside my army and my dungeon, the last of which was my doing specifically. She endured it because my law gave her no alternative that didn't end in a camp or a sold contract or a grave. He turned back to the assembly. The law is wrong. It ends today. The hall erupted. She stood inside the noise of it, generals objecting, council members rising, Draven's voice cutting through the rest, with precise citations of precedent. And she let it move around her and looked at Kyle, and found him already looking back. He was not doing this because she was his mate. She understood that clearly, and it mattered to her more than she had words for. He was doing it because he had finally stood inside his own law and felt its actual weight, and he was a man who could not unknow a true thing once it had found him. The arguments continued for a long time. She did not track all of them. Later, much later, when the hall had emptied and the decree had been recorded by a scribe who kept his expression carefully neutral, and Draven had withdrawn with the tight-jawed precision of a man reassessing his position, she found herself in the training yard. The same yard. The same gray stone and pale sky, and the faint smell of rain that never quite arrived. The place where the wind had shifted, and 4 months of careful construction had come apart in a single breath. She stood in it without soot on her skin, or linen around her ribs, or a borrowed name in her mouth. The morning air moved over her face, and she let it, and did not calculate what it carried, or who might be smelling it. Her hair was still short, still uneven at the ends, and she thought she might keep it that way for a while. It was hers. It had been hers even when it was Leo's, as underneath the purpose she had given it. She heard his step behind her and did not turn immediately. She was not ready to turn immediately, and she had decided somewhere in the past 24 hours that she was allowed to take the time she needed for things. The bond was present between them, warm and steady, and entirely different from the ache it had been when it had no direction. She could feel him the way you felt sunlight with your eyes closed, warmth without the source being visible, present and verifiable and real. He stopped a few feet behind her and said nothing, which was the right thing. She looked at the yard, the crack in the far wall still there, thin as a hair between the second stone and the third, and breathed in and out without measuring it. Her name was Lyra. She was from the Ashvin territory. She had survived a kingdom built to consume her by making herself into nothing, and she had come out the other side of it still present, still here, still the same essential thing beneath all the layers she had shed. She turned around. Kyle stood in the gray morning light without his crown, without the formal armor, looking at her with the expression she still had no word for and had decided she did not need one. Some things were allowed to remain unnamed. Some things were simply true without requiring a label to make them so. The yard was quiet. She was Lyra. That was enough. The decree took 3 days to engrave into the kingdom's stone record. Lyra knew this because Kyle told her. In the matter-of-fact way he delivered most information, directly, without ornamentation, as though facts were simply facts, and the weight of them was self-evident. She had come to recognize this as its own form of respect. He did not soften things for her. He had learned, in the dungeon and after it, that she did not need softening. She needed truth, plainly given, and she would do the rest herself. The law's dissolution was not quiet. She had not expected it to be. 3 generals submitted formal objections within the first day. 2 council members requested an emergency convening. Draven, methodical, precise, dangerous Draven, submitted a 14-page document outlining the legal and military precedents against the decree's validity, which Kale read in full, annotated in the margins in his compressed handwriting, and returned with a single-line response that she was not shown, but that caused Draven to be silent on the matter for the remainder of the week. She was not involved in any of it. That had been her condition. Stated plainly the morning after the haul, she would not be the reason the law changed, meaning she would not be the visible cause, the mate held up as justification. If the law broke, it had to break on its own wrongness, not on the fact of her. Kyle had looked at her for a long moment when she said it, and she had watched him understand why, and watched him agree without making her explain it further. She spent those 3 days in the wing with the window. She slept in a real bed for the first time in 4 months and found, the first night, that she could not do it, lay on her back on the actual mattress and stared at the ceiling and eventually moved to the floor, back against the wall, and slept there instead, and felt no particular shame about it. The floor was what she knew. She would find her way back to the bed when she was ready. There was no deadline. Bram came to find her on the second day. She had wondered about this, about the 3 of them, about what the barrack knew and how the story had moved through it. Bram arrived at her door with his cap in his hands and his broad face arranged in the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and forgotten it on the way over. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and then said simply, "We didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said. "We should have—" "No," she shook her head. "I was very good at it. And that was the point." She paused. "You saved me a seat at meals. That mattered more than you know." He nodded, turned his cap over in his hands. Then, with the careful gravity of someone presenting something of value, "Fen wants you to know he's furious he didn't figure it out first. He says it's a personal failure, and he's been insufferable about it for 2 days." She laughed. It came out rough from disuse, unfamiliar in her own throat, but real. Bram smiled, like a man who had been holding his breath and finally let it go. Cass she did not see, but she found, slipped under her door on the morning of the 3rd day, a folded piece of paper containing nothing but her name, her real name, Lyra, written in a careful hand, and beneath it, 2 words, "I knew." She held it for a long time. Then she folded it and kept it. On the 4th day, and 2 things happened. The decree was formally entered into record. The Vanguard law dissolved. A new provision drafted that barred neither gender from service and mandated equal armor, equal rank, equal consequence. And Kyle came to her door not as a king completing an obligation, but as a person who had something to say and had been working up to saying it. She let him in. He stood in the room with the window and looked at her, and the bond moved between them, warm and steady. And he said, "I don't know how to do this." She understood he did not mean the kingdom or the law or the logistics of what came next for either of them. He meant this: the simple proximity of the person you were made for after years of starvation and weeks of catastrophic misunderstanding, at now standing in an ordinary room in ordinary light with no crisis left to manage. "Neither do I," she said. Something in him settled at that. She watched it happen, the specific relief of a person who had expected to be the only one without a map and discovered the other person was also without a map, and the territory was therefore navigable together. "Then we start there," he said. She nodded. "We start there." It was not a declaration, it was not a promise wrapped in ceremony. It was just two people in a room with a window, telling each other the truth, which was the only foundation either of them had ever been able to build anything real on. Outside, the yard was full of sound. Recruits at drill, the drill master's voice carrying across the stone, the ordinary percussion of a morning in Veldara that was, in its smallness, entirely changed. She turned to the window and looked at it and thought about the woman who had stood in that yard 4 months ago, with soot on her face and linen around her ribs and a false name ready on her tongue, and felt the full distance between that morning and this one. Not healed. She did not pretend it healed. There was too much that would take longer than 4 days. The pack she had lost, the months she had spent erasing herself, the particular violence of being undone by the person who should have been her safety. Those were long reckonings, patient work, the kind that didn't resolve in a final chapter. But present. She was present in a way she had not been in a very long time, fully occupying the space she stood in, no part of herself folded down or covered over or filed away for later. Her name was her own. Her face was her own. Her voice, when she used it, came from wherever voices came from when they had nothing left to hide. That was enough to begin with. That was, she thought, everything. Lyra never wore the soot again, not because the world became safe. It didn't, not completely, not all at once. But because she had learned, in the hardest possible school, that disappearing was not the same as surviving. That making yourself into nothing was not protection. It was just a slower kind of ending. She had chosen a different kind instead. If Lyra's story found something in you, the part that has ever made itself smaller to stay safe, that has ever survived by becoming invisible, that has ever been undone by the one person who was supposed to be home, then you already know why this story had to end the way it did, not with a rescue. With a reckoning, not with someone saving her, with Lyra saving herself on her own terms, in her own voice, with her own name. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you, and I will see you in my next one.